Healthy soils are essential for achieving broader goals, such as net zero carbon emission, reversing biodiversity loss, and sustaining human health. But to fix our soils, we must first understand them. We need tools to identify quickly the land that is being degraded and needs our attention. Then policymakers can target those areas with policies to promote sustainable land management and farming practices. For this series, we are interviewing some of the leading scientists who are working to create these tools. They are part of the project funded by the European Union called AI for Soil Health. And as the name suggests, they are using artificial intelligence and a range of other cutting-edge innovation to lead the way towards understanding our soils. In this episode, we hear from Bernhard Ahrens, project group leader at the Max Planck Institute for Biogeochemistry. Thank you for joining us today, Bernhard. What is soil organic carbon? Why is it important and how do we measure it?
That's a very fundamental question. I think in simplest terms, soil organic carbon is just the carbon component of soil organic matter. And soil organic matter basically depends on the input of, for example, litter to the soil, so leaves or harvest residues that are staying on the field. Then the microbes are decomposing this, and also then the microbial residues that stay in the soil form soil organic matter, and the carbon component, as I said, is then soil organic carbon. One can further distinguish this into two very important fractions, the particulate organic carbon and mineral associated organic carbon, which have two very different properties when it comes to how stable they are in a warmer climate or which factors are responsible for stabilization. So to the other parts of your question, why is it important? It has a lot of different functions in the soil. So what it is most known for, I guess, nowadays is its role in climate change, so that there is a very big carbon stock in the soil that's bigger than the carbon stock in the atmosphere and the vegetation combined. And we are in danger of losing big parts of that in a warmer climate. And that is, of course, of relevance then to look at that. But then it's also relevant for plant growth. So that is a bit the dilemma of carbon storage versus carbon decomposition. For plants to grow, then it's also good to get the nutrients in the plant litter back. That's coming from the microbial decomposition. So it has then a role in giving nutrients back to the plant, but also a role in nutrient storage. Together with clay, it can store nutrients that then can be released to the plant. It has also a big role in kind of soil structure, so that determines the bulk density and the porosity of the soil and determines how well water can infiltrate into the soil. So these are all important functions of soil organic carbon.
And why is soil organic carbon an important indicator when it comes to understanding soil health then?
Yeah, it's basically a nice integrative indicator, so because it touches a lot of different functions. So there's on the one hand the climate change angle, and also we have the nutrient angle, that it gives nutrients back to the plant, but it also stores nutrients. And then it can also be a good indicator for soil structural effects. If we have more carbon, then soil structure is often better, and then there's better infiltration, or we are better preventing erosion.
And why is soil organic carbon important to stop a climate emergency?
There's a lot to say on the climate relevance of organic carbon. There's a lot of hope that storing more soil organic carbon could mitigate climate change. But of course, we have to see here also, are these hopes realistic? So is it realistic to increase a lot carbon inputs to the soil? So in agricultural systems, for example, if we want to increase the carbon inputs, we might also need to increase fertilizer inputs. So that could be problematic just for energy inputs, but also problematic for then side effects like nitrate leaching. So that's something we have to keep in mind. And then also for storing, for example, carbon in the form of mineral associated organic carbon, we need also nitrogen to store it in that form because it's mostly microbial derived, and microbial derived carbon has normally a very narrow C/N ratio. So that's something one has to keep in mind, and maybe then look rather at soils that already have a lot of organic carbon and to see what can we do to protect those soils from losing further organic carbon. So that could be, for example, drained peatlands that we then restore and stop the continued loss of organic carbon that has been going on for decades. So that would be then the question where we want to put our efforts towards increasing soil organic carbon, or maybe rather stopping the loss of existing soil organic carbon in carbon-rich soils.
Got it. And can you explain in simple terms how can we project the potential for soil to capture carbon, and why is it important also that for climate scientists?
Yes, so I'm working at the Max Planck Institute for Biogeochemistry, and there we look at really biogeochemical cycles. So we look then also at the feedback between carbon and climate. We could imagine a positive feedback loop or a self-enforcing feedback loop to say that better. As temperatures get higher, soil organic carbon is likely to be decomposed at faster rates. And then this decomposition of soil organic carbon releases further CO2 into the atmosphere, which might reinforce then the climate warming. And so this could be then a self-enforcing cycle. When we look at projections, how we think soil carbon stocks will evolve in the future, there are a lot of uncertainties. There's a lot of uncertainties with regard to understanding still. So a useful framework is particulate organic carbon and minerals associated organic carbon framework, so that we simply think about soil organic carbon in these two terms and then think for these two fractions, what are the drivers of stabilization. So for particulate organic carbon, when we have a lot of particulate organic carbon like in peatlands or in permafrost, but also maybe an organic layer of forest that's mostly stabilized to low temperatures or high moisture contents. And then we could see in this particular organic carbon might be more vulnerable to climate change, whereas the mineral associated organic carbon that's stabilized through interactions with mineral surfaces, so for example, clay minerals. With that, we have a lower vulnerability to climate change. And this is then something kind of one has to consider when we want to look at how much carbon we may lose in the future. And then it, of course, depends also on the emissions pathways we are on, because we are in a dynamic system. We have to know also our system, how much does it get warmer, then we can also say how much carbon we may lose, but there's also quite some uncertainty in our understanding still. The mineral interactions, and then how will microbes behave in a warmer climate.
And based on this level of uncertainty, is there anything policymakers can do to reduce the uncertainty if they're trying to understand and improve soil's role in carbon capture?
So I think policymakers, it might be actually useful to try to think in this framework of particulate organic carbon and mineral associated organic carbon. Might be a little bit uncommon for them at first, but if you think about it, that particulate organic carbon that's stabilized by basically low temperatures or high moisture, and mineral associated organic carbon really by it's kind of more in the mineral soil and by association with clay surfaces, then you understand a bit, if you look at certain landscapes, is this soil vulnerable to climate change or not? And then are already doing is in Europe, there's this nice Lucas survey where we have repeated measurements of soil organic carbon. And there we also have now measurements of this mineral associated organic carbon, particulate organic carbon. So that's very important to have kind of a good databases for that. And when it comes to the climate change aspect, we also need to know not only the soil organic carbon content, so what is commonly measured in these surveys, but in Lucas we also have, for example, density measurements, so how dense the soil is. So in a forest soil or a forest floor, you would have a very fluffy soil, not very dense, and that has quite an effect on the calculation of the carbon stocks. So that's what policymakers would be interested in compared to a mineral soil, which is of course very dense but has much lower carbon content. So that's something we need to know, and I think we need to also continue this monitoring, which allows us then to give insights on European scale how soil organic carbon stocks currently are and how they might be changing in the future when we look at these two different carbon fractions.
Yeah, good. But then if we move more on the technological side, why do you think is artificial intelligence important when it comes to soil carbon models?
We have been using artificial intelligence already for years in soil organic carbon modeling. So there's, I would say, two ways to do soil organic carbon modeling. One, data-driven, so an artificial intelligence to look at soil organic carbon. So to basically take all the measurements we've done, for example, in Europe, and then use artificial intelligence algorithms to learn the drivers of soil organic carbon and then produce European maps or even global maps of soil organic carbon. But of course, we are here a little bit in a situation which is not quite suited for artificial intelligence. So we don't have these really big data amounts companies like Facebook or others have from user-generated data, but we have much less data. Although there is a lot out there, we are not in the super big data situation, but more in a medium-sized data situation. So we then also have to bring in kind of knowledge that we've gained in maybe lab experiments or field experiments, but also mechanistic models into the equation or into the story, so that we not completely derive all our findings just from the data, but also bring in other sources of knowledge. And that's something I personally try to do in AI for soil health, to combine different sources of knowledge, not only data, but also mechanistic models.
Yeah. And looking actually at the AI for Soil Health project, what have you been working exactly if we look at the project, how that contributed to the soil mission?
What I've been working on in AI for soil health is really to combine, let's say, classical artificial intelligence with mechanistic models. We call that hybrid modeling. So we try to not only learn from data, but we also put our mechanistic model into the equation so that we can then, for example, use a model that also models particulate organic carbon and mineral-associated organic carbon. And then we can put in, for example, the climate sensitivity of these two fractions in our mechanistic model. And by that, we combine the best of two worlds. We learn a lot from the data, but we also can actually learn a bit more about the data because we can confront it with our understanding of the system and see if that fits together. And specifically, I'm looking here then also at how much extra carbon one could store in soils and if an increase in storage is realistic. So especially for mineral-associated organic carbon, there's a theoretical upper limit that's seen often also in the data. So that's then dependent on clay and silt content. But of course, one has to also look at then how much carbon we can have in a system based on the environmental conditions we are in. So how much carbon input we have, how high the temperature is, and how the soil moisture is, for example, or also pH. So that can give us then an idea how much we can get up to this maximum capacity for mineral-associated organic carbon. And I think that's an important thing to look at to inform policymakers how realistic it can be to store additional soil organic carbon, and then also to inform them about in which form the soil organic carbon is dominant. So to look at basically how sensitive it might be to climate change.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
AI for Soil Health is funded by the European Union and has received funds from UK Research and Innovation under the UK government's Horizon Europe funding guarantee. For more information, visit aiforsoilhealth.eu. That is AI for as number soilhealth.eu.